On a Wednesday morning in October, I opened my front door to find a piece of paper taped to it. Not slipped underneath. Not mailed. Taped directly to the wood of the door my father had painted the summer before he passed away, in the specific shade of blue he had chosen because my mother had mentioned once that she liked it, and he had remembered 3 years later. The paper was an official eviction notice, signed, stamped, and dated, giving me 72 hours to vacate the property that my parents had owned for 23 years. The property that had transferred to me upon my mother's passing 18 months earlier. The property where I had lived my entire life, and for which I had every document, deed, title, tax records, utilities, everything, filed in a folder in the second drawer of my father's old desk exactly where he had always kept them. I read the notice twice, then I read it a third time because I was certain I was misunderstanding something. An eviction notice requires grounds. It requires legal process. It requires a basis in reality that this piece of paper on its face did not appear to have. I called the number at the bottom of the notice. A man answered. He identified himself as Captain Gerald Moore of the city's housing authority. He told me, in a tone that I can only describe as the voice of someone who has done this before and found it goes smoothly when they use that tone, that the property had been flagged for a compliance issue, that the eviction was fully authorized, and that if I had not vacated by Friday evening, he would have no choice but to involve law enforcement. He said all of that, then he said, "I'd recommend you not make this harder than it needs to be." I want to tell you what I said back. I said, "I'd recommend you have your documentation ready, because I'm going to need to see all of it." He hung up. My name is Sarah. And what I found in the 72 hours after that phone call, about Captain Gerald Moore, about the man behind him, about the pattern of what they had been doing to people in my neighborhood for 3 years, is something that ended 2 careers, triggered a federal investigation, and made the front page of our city's newspaper. Stay with me, because this is not a story about one corrupt officer. It is a story about what happens when one person refuses to be the quiet end of a long chain of crimes. I need to tell you about the house before I tell you anything else. Not because property is more important than people, but because understanding what the house meant to my family is the only way to understand why walking away from it was never going to be something I was capable of doing. My parents bought the house in 1999. It was not large, 3 bedrooms, a narrow backyard, a kitchen that my mother spent 15 years gradually improving one small element at a time until it was exactly the way she wanted it. My father, who worked in construction, had done most of the renovations himself over the years. The blue front door, the built-in bookshelves in the living room, the back porch he added the summer I turned 12 because I had mentioned wanting somewhere to sit outside and read. They paid it off in full by the time I was in high school. Not easily, with discipline and consistency, and the specific financial patience of 2 people who understood that a paid-off home was the most durable form of security available to them. My father passed away 6 years ago, my mother 18 months before the eviction notice. The house transferred to me through a properly executed will, properly filed with the county, properly recorded in every relevant system. I had done everything correctly, not because I had anticipated needing to, but because my father had always said that proper documentation was the only thing that stood between what you owned and someone else's claim on it. I had the deed, I had the title. I had the transfer documentation, the tax records going back 23 years, the utility accounts in my name. I had the folder in the second drawer of my father's desk exactly where he had always kept it. When I read that eviction notice for the 3rd time, the first thing I did was go to that drawer. Everything was there. Everything that said this house was mine and had been my family's for 23 years, and that no housing authority officer had any legal basis to remove me from it in 72 hours. The second thing I did was call Rachel. Rachel had been my closest friend since college. She worked in local government, an administrative role that had given her, over 8 years, a detailed understanding of how city departments operated, and more relevantly, how they were supposed to operate versus how they sometimes actually did. I read her the eviction notice over the phone. She was quiet through the whole thing. When I finished, she said, "Read me the compliance issue they cited." I read it. It was vague, a reference to a housing code violation that was not specified beyond a code number. Rachel said, "Give me that code number." She called me back 40 minutes later. Her voice had a quality I recognized, the controlled precision of someone who has found something significant and is choosing their words carefully. The code number cited in Moore's notice did not correspond to any violation that had been filed against my property in the city's public records system. There was no inspection report. There was no complaint. There was no record of any interaction between the housing authority and my address in the previous 5 years. The eviction notice had cited a violation that did not exist in any official record. "Sarah," Rachel said, "this is not a paperwork error. A paperwork error is the wrong address or a transposed number. This is a cited violation with no supporting documentation in a system where that documentation would have to exist if the violation were real. This was manufactured." I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked, Why would a housing authority officer manufacture an eviction for a property that has no violations and clear ownership documentation? Rachel said. "That is exactly the right question, and I think we need to answer it before Friday." We spent the next several hours answering it. Public records are remarkable things. Not because they are easy to navigate, they are not, but because in a city where information is theoretically accessible, a person who knows what they are looking for and where to look can find things that were never intended to be found in combination. Rachel knew what to look for. And what she found, pulling together city planning documents, property transfer records, development permit applications, and meeting minutes from city council sessions over the previous 18 months, was a picture that neither of us had expected, and that, once assembled, was impossible to look away from. My street, the 3 blocks immediately surrounding my home, had been quietly designated as a priority development zone 8 months earlier. The designation was buried in a planning document that had received no public coverage and had been approved in a city council session attended by 12 people, including the council members themselves. A development company had filed a permit application to build a mixed-use residential and commercial complex on that land. The application was pending. Its approval was contingent on land acquisition, specifically on the developer acquiring the properties on those 3 blocks. Several of those properties had already changed hands in the previous year. Not through normal market transactions, through distressed sales and quiet transfers, in several cases preceded by housing authority actions that had created pressure on the owners to sell. Councilman Victor Blake had voted in favor of the development zone designation. Councilman Victor Blake had also, through a family trust that was publicly registered but not prominently advertised, a financial interest in the development company. And Captain Gerald Moore had signed every single housing authority action associated with properties on those 3 blocks. I printed everything, 47 pages. I stacked them on my father's desk next to the folder in the second drawer, and I looked at what we had built and understood with absolute clarity that this was no longer just about my house. This was about every person on those 3 blocks who had already been pushed out. This was about the ones who had not yet been pushed. And this was about the 2 men who had built a system to do the pushing and had been counting on nobody looking closely enough to see how the pieces connected. I called Margaret Collins. Margaret Collins had been practicing civil rights and housing law for 21 years. Her office was small, 3 attorneys, a paralegal, and a waiting room with chairs that had seen better days. But her reputation was the kind that is built entirely through outcomes rather than marketing. She had taken on city housing departments before. She had won. I brought her the 47 pages. I brought my property documentation. I brought Rachel, who walked her through the public records research with the precision of someone who had spent the previous 14 hours organizing it into a sequence that was impossible to misunderstand. Margaret listened without interrupting. She read through the key documents herself. She asked several specific questions about sourcing, how we had found each document, whether the copies were certified, whether the digital records had been screenshotted with metadata intact. When she was satisfied, she set the papers down and said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "Sarah, I want you to understand something before we talk about strategy. What you have brought me is not just evidence of what was done to you. It is evidence of a pattern that almost certainly has other victims. People who did not have your documentation, who did not have Rachel, who did not know to look, who took the notice at face value and left. This case, if we pursue it correctly, is not just about your house. It is about everyone they have ever done this to." I said, "Then let's pursue it correctly." she said. Good, then the first thing we do is not file anything. The first thing we do is find Frank. Frank was 71 years old and had lived in the building 3 doors down from me for 19 years. He had moved out 4 months earlier. I had noticed his absence but had attributed it to a family relocation, the kind of thing that happens without announcement in neighborhoods where people do not always know each other well enough for formal goodbyes. Margaret had found his name in the Housing Authority records. He had received a notice 14 months before mine. His property was one of the ones that had transferred, a sale that had gone through at a price significantly below market value, under circumstances that Margaret had identified as worth examining. We found him at his daughter's house in a suburb an hour outside the city. He was living in her spare bedroom. He had not wanted to leave. He said that clearly, directly, in the specific voice of a man who has been trying to find the words for something for 14 months and is relieved to finally have someone to say them to. He had received a notice similar to mine. He had called the number. He had spoken to Moore, who had told him, and this is important, that the violation was serious and that the city could pursue him for back penalties if he did not vacate quickly. Frank had not had a lawyer. Frank had not had Rachel. Frank had had a 70-year-old man's reasonable trust that official notices from official officers carried official authority, and Moore had known that when he made the call. Frank had vacated within 48 hours. He had sold the property 2 weeks later at a price he now knew was far below what it was worth because a developer's representative had appeared within days of his departure, as if they had known he was leaving. As if someone had told them. Frank's hands were steady when he told us this. His voice was steady. But there was something in his eyes that I recognized from my own weeks of processing, the specific anger of someone who has understood that they were deliberately targeted and who has been carrying that understanding alone. He said, "What are you going to do with what I'm telling you?" Margaret said. "We are going to use it to make sure it does not happen to anyone else, and to make sure the people who did it to you are held accountable. If you are willing to be part of that." He said yes before she finished the sentence. Over the following 3 weeks, while Moore's deadline came and passed, while Margaret had filed an emergency injunction that prevented any enforcement action on my property pending legal proceedings, while Rachel and I worked every evening building the documentation, the evidence package grew. Margaret identified 4 additional former residents of our 3-block area who had received similar notices from Moore over the previous 3 years. 3 of them agreed to speak. The 4th could not be reached, but their case was documented in public records sufficiently to be included. Each case followed the same pattern. A notice citing a vague violation with no supporting documentation in the public record. A phone call from Moore using the same language, compliance issue, 72 hours, no need to make this harder. A sale that followed the departure, in each case to a buyer connected to the same development company. In each case, Moore had been the signing officer. Daniel Pierce was an investigative journalist at the city's primary newspaper who had been covering City Hall corruption for 6 years. Margaret knew him, had worked with him before on 2 separate cases where public documentation needed someone who could explain its significance to a general audience. She called him on a Thursday. He met with us Friday morning. He read the evidence package in approximately 2 hours and said when he looked up, "How long have you been sitting on this?" Margaret said, "Long enough to make sure it was right." "Now it is right." Daniel spent the following 2 weeks doing his own verification, independently confirming the public record findings, reaching 2 additional sources inside City Hall who spoke on background, and building the story in parallel with our legal filing so that both could move simultaneously. The strategy was Margaret's and it was deliberate. The legal filing alone might be managed quietly, delayed, and diminished. The legal filing combined with a front-page investigative piece published the same morning would be significantly harder to manage quietly. We filed on a Tuesday. The story ran Tuesday morning. I want to tell you what Tuesday felt like from the inside because I think it matters. Margaret called me at 7 in the morning to tell me the filing had been submitted. Daniel's story went live on the newspaper's website at 7:30. By 9 o'clock, the story had been picked up by 2 regional outlets. By noon, it had reached national aggregators. The evidence package, the 47 pages that Rachel and I had built on my father's desk, was reproduced in part in Daniel's piece, with the public records hyperlinked so that any reader could verify the sourcing themselves. The connection between Moore, Blake, and the development company was laid out in a sequence so clear that it required no interpretation. Moore's office issued a statement at 11 o'clock stating that the housing authority took compliance with proper procedures seriously and would be reviewing the cases mentioned. The statement did not address any of the specific allegations. It read like what it was, a statement written by someone who had been caught and did not yet know how bad it was going to get. Blake's office issued nothing. His spokesman said the councilman was unavailable for comment. By the following morning, that spokesman had resigned. The city's inspector general opened a formal investigation by Wednesday afternoon. A federal housing agency contacted Margaret's office by Thursday morning to request the full evidence package. Moore was placed on administrative leave Friday. Frank called me Friday evening. He had seen the coverage. His daughter had shown him the newspaper story on her phone. He was quiet for a moment when I answered. Then he said, "I kept thinking I should have fought it, that I should have known something was wrong." I said, "You trusted what an official officer told you. That is not a failure. That is what they were counting on." He said, "Well, they miscounted on you." The formal outcomes took 8 months to fully resolve. I want to give you the summary clearly because the details matter. Captain Gerald Moore was terminated from the Housing Authority and subsequently charged with abuse of office, filing false official documents, and conspiracy. The conspiracy charge connecting him to Blake and to the development company's acquisition strategy. He entered a plea agreement. He did not go to trial. Councilman Victor Blake resigned from his council seat within 3 weeks of the story breaking. The federal investigation into his financial interest in the development company and his vote on the development zone designation resulted in charges that I am not able to fully detail here because some proceedings are still ongoing. What I can tell you is that his political career is over, and that the financial interest he believed was obscure enough to be invisible turned out to be exactly visible enough to matter. The development company's permit application was withdrawn. The development zone designation was reviewed and overturned by the new city council. The 3-block area where my family's house sits is not a development zone. 3 of the former residents who had been displaced received settlements from the city, not large ones, not enough to undo what had been done to them, but formal acknowledgments that what had happened to them was wrong and legally actionable. Frank received a settlement. He moved back to the city, not to his old property which had already been sold and resold, but to an apartment nearby. He came to my house for dinner the month he moved back. He sat at my mother's kitchen table and ate and looked around at the built-in bookshelves and the blue front door visible through the window and said, "Your father did good work." I said, "He did." I think about that a lot. I have been asked, many times since this became public, whether I felt like a hero for what I did. I want to answer that honestly because I think the hero framing misses something important. I did not do something heroic. I did something that any person with the right documentation, the right friend, the right attorney, and the decision not to comply with an illegal demand could have done. The reason it felt significant is not because I was extraordinary. It is because the system that Moore and Blake had built was counting on ordinary people, responding to official pressure the way ordinary people generally do respond to it. By complying, they had built their system on the assumption that the people they targeted would not have the resources, the knowledge, or the access to the right people to effectively resist. They had been right about that assumption for 3 years and multiple victims. They were wrong about me. Not because I am exceptional, but because I had my father's folder in the second drawer of his desk, and Rachel who knew public records, and Margaret who knew the law, and Daniel who knew how to tell a story, and Frank who was willing to speak when someone finally asked him to. The system worked, not easily, not quickly, and not without costing me 3 months of my life and a level of sustained stress that I am still recovering from. But it worked. What I want you to take from this is not that corruption always gets exposed. It does not. What I want you to take is that the first line of defense against people who abuse official power is documentation, your own, kept carefully from the beginning before you need it. My father understood this. His folder in that drawer was not paranoia. It was the specific wisdom of someone who knew that what you own is only as secure as your ability to prove that you own it. Keep your documents. Know your rights. And if someone in a position of authority tells you to do something that does not feel right, find someone who knows whether it is. That phone call is worth making. I know because I made it. If you have ever been told by someone in authority that you have no choice, that the process is already done, that the decision has been made, that resistance is pointless, I want you to hear something clearly. Official-looking documents are not automatically legitimate. Official-sounding voices are not automatically right. The confidence with which someone tells you that you have no options is not evidence that you have no options. It is sometimes evidence that they are counting on you believing you have none. Document everything. Find someone who knows the law, tell your story to someone who can help you tell it correctly, and do not vacate. If this story meant something to you, if you have been through something like this or know someone who has, leave a comment below. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These stories matter beyond the people they happen to.